Back into our Job series. So this is our second week through Job. We are going through the Bible in a year, which has been quite an endeavor, and we're only half a month in, right? And I have to say, for those of you that have survived Job, well done. Collective deep breath. But we want to create a couple of ways that we can symbolize completing and going through that journey. And so the first one is, you can see in our little reading corner over here, as we complete a book, we'll see one of the books show up over there. So you see Job as we complete that, and then obviously Genesis will be next. The next is a little bit more artistic way that we can symbolize and celebrate the completion of one of the books, and that's in the back left corner. And yes, I ruined some people's seats. I've already got flack for it, but I will survive. But back there you'll see it's just a little bit of like a nail art type thing, and there's some rubber bands. So the idea is, after you complete one of the books, you would grab a rubber band and put it there, and there'll be a bunch of different colors, and it'll eventually look pretty cool. However, the cool thing is, eventually as we go through it, it'll go from what looks like just a bunch of random nails to actually spelling out hope. Which is our hope, and our desire is that we actually find the hope-filled light of Jesus throughout God's word, from Genesis to Revelation, as we go through this year. So those are two ways to just join us in that. I did forget in the intro or the welcome to mention that our candles are lit for a reason this week, as they always are. We want to celebrate. Our evangelism team went out on Saturday. We were able to pray with 3 to 5 different people. I don't actually know the specific number, but they were able to go out and pray at homes. And then also this last week, 5 people accepted Christ out of our jail ministry. The ladies prayed, and Pasco and in Hernando. So we have a lot to celebrate of sharing the light of Christ into dark situations. But today, getting to our sermon in Job, this is our second week. Today we are looking at how to find hope in grief. And if you're going through the handout, that first truth is, grief is a universal human experience. Loss is truly what grief is. We all will go through loss and hardship, rejection. And when those moments happen, it can almost feel like a wave that just overwhelms you, can it not? But it's something that hits every single one of us. Well, and we see in the story of Job not only mourning and grieving the loss of his loved ones, but also we'll see, as we see in chapter 29 and 30, as we talk about today, he's grieving the loss of standing, relationships, and joy. And so today we're going to look at this witness of Job to see through his life, through a very dramatic story and experience, how we might be able to find hope in the midst of grief. And so we're going to have Esther come up and read. If you would like to join us, we are going to be reading the entirety of Job 29. If you see in the chair backs, the Bible's there. If you open one of those, it'll be on page 451. If you have your phone, look it up. We're going to be reading through the NIV together. So if you would, just join us as we read God's word together.
Job continued his discourse. How I long for the months gone by, for the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone on my head, and by his light I walked through darkness. Oh, for the days when I was in my prime, when God's intimate friendship blessed my house, when the Almighty was still with me and my children were around me, when my path was drenched with cream and the rock poured out for me streams of olive oil. When I went to the gate of the city and took my seat in the public square, the young men saw me and stepped aside, and the old men rose to their feet. The chief men refrained from speaking and covered their mouths with their hands. The voices of the nobles were hushed, and their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths. Whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me, because I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to assist them. The one who was dying blessed me. I made the widow's heart sing. I put on righteousness as my clothing. Justice was my robe and my turban. I was eye to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy. I took up the case of the stranger. I broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched the victims from their teeth. I thought, I will die in my own house, my days as numerous as the grains of sand. My roots will reach to the water, and the dew will lie all night on my branches. My glory will not fade. The bow will be ever new in my hand. People listened to me expectantly, waiting in silence for my counsel. After I had spoken, they spoke no more. My words fell gently on their ears. They waited for me as for showers and drank in my words as the spring rain. When I smiled at them, they scarcely believed it. The light of my face was precious to them. I chose the way for them and sat as their chief. I dwelt as a king among his troops. I was like one who comforts mourners.
Thank you. So we see in Job 29 some very vivid descriptions of how he has lived his life. But I want to begin with asking this question is, what do we grieve? Because grief really is simply loss, isn't it not? And we can lose a lot of different things. We can lose a job, maybe even unexpectedly, without any promise of continual support. That will create some grieving. Or a loss of a dream. Have you ever had an idea of how the future would play out, and like a stained glass mirror, it just gets broken? And it just creates a grief within you. Maybe you lose due to divorce. The image of what you thought life would look like changed, creating loss. Maybe your family dynamics have created a sense of loss and grief because guess what? Family sometimes doesn't get along. And sometimes relationships can get complicated. And sometimes things can be said that can't be unsaid. And things change, creating loss and grief. It can play out so many different ways. Addictions can make you feel this truth that you have lost your ability to control yourself, which creates a grief in your life. It can simply be the journey of disability, the reality of losing a part of yourselves where you once were able to do something and now you can't. Or you have to do it differently than you did before. Simply aging can be a journey of loss. Infertility. Even empty nest for those in that season of life when the kids have left can leave an emptiness, a loss. For some, even retirement can be this loss of identity, especially if it's forced upon you. Loss is all around us, and it's not just in our personal life, and it can even play out in possessions. Like if we think of our brothers and sisters in Christ and those that live in California right now, oh my, so much lost, so much grief. It's everywhere. And it's not just in our personal life, but it's also in our spiritual life, because sometimes we grieve the loss of unanswered prayers, where we have been praying for weeks and months and years and we don't see the thing happen. Has a weight of loss to it. Sometimes, just like our family, sometimes our church family don't act very nicely. And sometimes we have church hurt, where those, and pastors screw up. I mess up. Sometimes we can get hurt and lose that community in the midst of life. All of that to say, loss is a universal reality of humanity. Grieving is something that exists for us all. And hear me, there is no point in comparing, weighing, or belittling the grief of others. Loss is loss. Grief is grief. And when it has overwhelms you, it is overwhelming you no matter how it plays out in your life. Because that loss is so hard. And in my own life, I can remember as I graduated college, I graduated up in Indiana. This is where my wife and I grew up. And when I graduated from college or was getting close to it, I had a lot of expectations. I was pretty well connected within the churches there in the community. My family was well known. I had been active in ministry my whole life up until that point. And I was even active at a church at the time, and I really thought I was going to get a job offer before I graduated. Now, that's a little bit cocky, confident, Pastor Todd maybe. But I was so sure that this whole thing was going to pan out, and when graduation hit, the reality was I didn't. I wasn't wanted. That was a loss. But for me, God opened a door that was really unexpected, and God just started to call Whitney and I as we'd gotten married at that point, and God had called us to plant a church in Florida. Like I said, I'm from Indiana, so who doesn't want to move to Florida? So we moved down here, and we moved with 2 other couples, so there's 4 of us coming from other places, and there's a few other people we knew. So we knew about 8 people when we moved to Florida. Without any jobs. And to a place where rent was about 5 times more than what we were paying in Indiana. Steps of faith, steps of obedience. But God provided. It's so cool. When we step out in faith, God can provide so many times. And in this, He totally did financially. We had loved ones, family members who stepped up to join us in prayer that would give financially. We had family, friends, my home church that I grew up in. Like, I was there from diapers until graduation. It's my home. Whitney was a part of the church as well. And they chose to support us as missionaries. Like, we got the little prayer cards and everything. That they would support us and love us. Well, fast forward 5 years later, and by every metrics, our church plant was a failure. Like, that stinks even just saying it. That moment of living and breathing and giving so much of our life and seeing it really not pan out to something that even survived that first 5 years. For us to even survive as a community, we had to merge with another Wesleyan church that is still going on. And I say yes and amen to that reality. But the truth is, I had to go home and face family, friends, and a home church that loved and supported me and admit we failed. That was a loss. That was something I grieved. Something in me, as I talked about even last week, and I've processed this a few times with our church, but hear me, I gave my life to ministry. I gave it all. Like, God, you're not going to take care of me? I was obedient. It should be successful. That's the arrangement we made. But as we talked about last week, that's not really how our relationship with God really works. Obedience does not equal success. It's just about obedience. And I've learned a lot of lessons, and I think it's set me up for a different type of ministry as I've matured, and I could have a lot longer conversation in that. But hear me, the feeling of loss and grief was incredibly deep for me and Whitney. Even more so for some of those that were planting with us. No one who started a church with us is still in ministry. That hurts. Some of them got to the brink of losing their faith, questioning God in the midst of this. Our losses play out in so many different areas of our life. But what do we do? How do we go through this journey? Because grief is going to impact us all. And what does our culture say? How does our culture process grief? And I got to say, as a pastor, as a father, as a husband, as a human being, I am infuriated at how our culture handles grief. How I handle grief in my own humanity. And that's for two reasons. The first is we don't give much time, if any, to actually grieve properly. There is this expectation that a loss happens and within a day or two, maybe a week, you need to be acting like everything's okay. You need to be back at work producing whatever you need to produce. You need to be engaged in your family life like nothing happened in almost no time. The first thing is we don't give enough time. The second is this, that our culture is so centered on positive thinking and self-help strategies that if you do these things, you'll be all right. You do these things and you'll overcome, you'll achieve, and you'll have the positive outcome that you want. We have little to no space for topics like death or sadness or failure. We simply tell you to get over it, to move on. We as a culture hate sitting in grief. We are uncomfortable with negative emotions. I am uncomfortable with negative emotions. To the point I wanted to avoid Job. But then for some reason we decided to go through the whole Bible. It's impossible. And even for myself as a pastor, too often I see somebody come to me with things that they are struggling with that happened 10, 20, 30 years ago. And in the humanity in the back of my mind, I hope I don't say this, but in the humanity in the back of my mind, I say, why haven't you got over this by now? We don't do well with grief as a culture, and sometimes not as a church culture either. But today we get to go through God's word where Job kind of gives us a little bit of a hint, a little bit of encouragement of how do we actually find hope in grief? How do we find hope through grief? And the first way that Job shows us, literally as he walks through it, is that he shows us that we can find hope in grief by remembering the past. The passage that Esther read for us kind of reflects the nostalgia of God's blessing on your life. When you're in the midst of something hard, isn't it kind of cool to look back and like, man, life was good? It allows you to see that pain of the loss because Job is longing for when the time before the grief hit him. There's that remembering. And for us, grief affects how we view the world. It's almost like a pair of glasses that are colored. And it affects how you see everything, including the past. And so we can kind of be on a spectrum where we see it kind of like Job, where everything was great until this stuff happened. Or everything is horrible and nothing was ever good. And we live in that spectrum. But the truth is, God has been faithful in your past. And if we reject or look too negatively on the past, we forget to see God's movement in our lives. The journey that God has taken us on. And he's done the same for Job as well. And we see this nostalgia. And I love this passage. And throughout Job, if you're with us reading through it, you see that Job doesn't hold anything back. He describes it in full color. Full feeling. And we see this in 29. How I long for the months gone by. See if you've ever thought this kind of thing. For the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone on my head, and by his light I walked through the darkness. Oh, for the days when I was in my prime, when God's intimate friendship blessed my house. There are times in our lives where we need to remember God's faithfulness in our past. And it's that reality that allows us to do the next step in this journey of healing, which is to face the present. Because we see this nostalgia in 29, and in 30, it switches pretty quickly to Job vividly describing his current situation. And it's not just the loss of loved ones. He's talking about the humiliation, the abandonment, the cruelty of those around him. Some of the chapter 30 is this in verse 1. But now they mock me, men younger than I, whose father I would have disdained to put with my sheepdogs. Whew. Continuing in verse 9, and now these young men mock me in song. I have become a byword among them. They detest me and keep their distance. They do not hesitate to spit on my face. Quite a contrast from 29, is it not? 16, and now my life ebbs away. Days of suffering grip me. Night pierces my bone. My gnawing pains never rest. The churning inside me never stops. Days of suffering confront me. I go about blackened not by the sun, but by standing up in the assembly and cry for help. I have become a brother of jackals and a companion of owls. My skin grows black and peels. My body burns with fever. My lyre is turned to mourning. My pipe to the sound of wailing. Job is feeling it all. And sometimes if we are on the receiving end, we'd say, Job, that's a little much. But Job is expressing how he sees his interaction, what is happening in this present reality. And so my encouragement, the only way that you can truly reflect on the present moment is that if you're honest with God and with yourself. It's the only way to look at this present moment accurately. But for us, I don't know, do not raise your hand, but how many of you are avoiders? I am. I want to avoid complex emotions. I want to avoid negative things. I want to respond in the I'm fine category. How are you doing? I'm fine. It's that two-word statement that puts a wall up between you and whoever you're interacting with, which says, I don't want to dig into this. I'm fine. I'm in my avoidance mode. But when we stay in that I'm fine, it prevents us from truly being honest with ourselves and honest with God. It's a coping mechanism for us to prevent us from feeling the depth of grief. Job's lament shows us that it's not sinful to go to the deepest parts of our grief, to be honest with God, to express our pain to Him. We see in Job 30, once again in verse 20, I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. You turn on me ruthlessly. With the might of your hand, you attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm. I know you will bring me down to death, to the place appointed for all the living. It is not a sin to question God. He's big enough to handle your honesty. He's strong enough to handle your big feelings. He's loving enough to sit with you in that moment of everything that is hitting you. But God can only get there when you're honest. When you break out of that I'm fine reality. And when we grieve, one of the first questions that we want to hit, or even when we just lose anything, we want to ask why. Do we not? We as humans want to know the backstory. Why did this happen? Why did this good person die? Why did somebody get cancer? Why did this accident happen? Why? And I think it's It's okay human response to ask that question. But the truth is, it's a question that can never actually be answered. Because there's never enough information to satisfy the cycles of why. And so I encourage you, yes, have that season, but don't stay in the why question. Start asking the who question. What is God doing in the midst of this? Who is God drawing me into being? Job himself asks a lot of why. And in a conversation with the divine, Job doesn't get an answer. He kind of gets an attitude adjustment to humbly walk with God. He's big enough. He's with us in the midst of that. One of the most significant losses in my life is when we lost our first child. Before Ellie, we were pregnant, and we had just reached that moment of announcing the future of our family. Can you remember that joy when you're just about ready to share that news? And we had reached that point in celebration with our friends, and family, and loved ones. And pretty soon after we made that announcement, we went on a vacation with some friends to Georgia. It was a great adventure, but on the way back, we were in a car accident. And I honestly don't know the cause and effect reality here, but because of that, we went to the doctor and we found out that we had lost our first child due to miscarriage. I know this is something that so many couples, so many people have went through. It is heart-wrenching loss. It's something that broke something inside of me and inside of Whitney that honestly I didn't know how to heal from. But all I knew was I was angry. I was confused. I wanted to ask the why questions. And for me, I knew that if I didn't deal with this anger, it would consume me. Have you ever had one of those moments where you just know I got to deal with this or this is going to go bad for my soul and my life? And so for me, what I had to do is I had to take a 2-day trip to actually a Catholic retreat center in St. Leo, or San Antonio, St. Leo Abbey. And so I went there for 2 days. And for pretty much 2 days, I just expressed to God how infuriated I was with him. I'm a pastor. I did the things. You're not going to protect my family? Why would this happen? Our family was right at the beginning of starting off and all of the realities. Why? And I got to tell, I asked why and why and why. I didn't necessarily get any satisfying answers, but after 2 days, I was able to say I took a step towards healing. But it was only because I was able to be honest with God, and maybe even more importantly, honest with myself. Because sometimes we get caught in that I'm fine reality. Instead of being honest about the healing that needs to happen. And hear me, there's still scars in that season of life that if touched in the wrong way will still impact my heart. Grieving is a healing of loss. It is a healing from pain. It is not something you overcome and you conquer. But the thing is, we're not alone. Jesus, the Son of God, went through it himself. Jesus went through grief. Jesus went through loss. His own brothers and sisters didn't believe in him in the beginning. His own mother called him out every once in a while in confusion. One of his best friends, one of the 12, betrayed him. He lost one of his best friends in Lazarus. One of the shortest verses, actually it is the shortest passage in the Bible, but so important is that Jesus wept. It's great for kids' memorization, but it is a deep truth. Jesus wasn't afraid of his feelings. Now, Jesus did kind of bring Lazarus back to life, so that's kind of a God card that he got to play. But he doesn't avoid pain and suffering, as we see in the fact that he was willing to die, be tortured for us. We serve a God who is with us and has been with us and has done it himself. So we see that in Jesus, but we also see it even in 1 Peter. This is one of my favorite passages as Peter encouraged the church then and us today that we need to cast our anxieties, cast our burdens on the Lord. Why? Because he cares about you. God cares about our loss. God cares about our grief and is big enough to handle it. C.S. Lewis has a great quote in this conversation of grief specific to death as he talks about in A Grief Observed, which is a story of literally how he went through his wife's passing, and he describes it this way: death of a beloved is an amputation. It's literally losing a part of yourself. That's what loss and grief really is. And as I said a moment ago, even for myself, processing my own grief and all the different things, healing didn't happen in 2 days. And here's the truth as you look at the handout, is that grief has no timeline. As I said before, I don't know how many times in that human part of my head, it's surprised when somebody hasn't gotten over something in the amount of time I think they should have. And in our own humanity, we get stuck in this achieving and overcoming instead of healing and resting in whatever grief creates in us, because grief, once again, has no timeline. C.S. Lewis has another great description. It's such a vivid description of what grief is. And grief is like a long valley, winding, where at any bend you can come onto a totally new landscape. Grief is a unique thing where you don't know where the end is going to be in the valley. And when you get to that next corner, you don't know how it will hit you. Be kind to yourself, please. Be patient with yourself in this journey. Because grief is that gradual reordering of healing of your life. And C.S. Lewis in this book talks about how it's not just achieving or overcoming, but it's actually getting to the point where that loss turns from pain to gratitude. Not gratitude for the hurt or the pain, but gratitude for what God has done to you and through you because of it. As Pastor Josh talked about, where we have been comforted so we can be a comfort. Where we have went through a journey where we can find the joy in our past, even though the present truly hurts. The last thing to help us be in this midst of this present moment is this truth that it will create in us a feeling of isolation. Job experienced it as he was being forsaken by his friends, his wife, those that are with him. And it's just a description of people feel uncomfortable with grief and loss, and they will have a tendency to withdraw. And if I could recreate my notes that had already been printed after we talked about this, and God really talked to us as a team, I would strike that because it's a good description. But the truth and the encouragement I would like to give you is that you to draw near, to stay in community. Because it's a choice. Keep showing up even when you don't want to. Allow people, because most times when we get caught in the I'm fine barrier game, eventually we turn around and the people that were once there just aren't. Stay in community. We as the church are imperfect, and we won't call sometimes when we should, and we won't. I'm first one to admit, I like to avoid these hard feelings. But we try to be there, keep showing up. You'll be surprised at the healing that can happen just by staying in community. Because we have that tendency, once again, to privatize our grief, where we feel like grief is a one-man sport, but it is truly a community reality. And so we see our present accurately. The third step in this journey, and once again, I say step, not like it's something to achieve, but it's a healing journey. And that third reality is trusting God with our future. Once again, Job doesn't immediately find answers in his suffering. His story ultimately points to the revelation of who Jesus is. Because Jesus is the redemption of all of our suffering, all of our hope. We see in Romans 8:28 that truth that all things work for the good of those who love Christ. But that is a truth, as we talked about last week, that is in this life or in the next. We as Christians can hold that tension because once again, as Isaiah 53, is that the cross is the source of our hope. Isaiah 53 says, surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken and afflicted. Through his death and resurrection, he overcame the ultimate grief, the ultimate loss, which is separation from God. And as Revelation 21 instructs us that someday he will wipe every tear from our eyes. There will be no more pain or mourning or crying or pain, for the older things have passed away. Anyone else excited for the older things to pass away? Where there's a new heaven and a new earth, where the suffering and pain, the brokenness is gone. And it's just perfect relationship with God and with all of humanity and with creation. It's all good. We have to trust God with our future. So often, if we fail or we struggle with trusting God with the future because of our grief, our pain, and our loss, we get to the point where we really just try to control things. When we don't have process, if we haven't healed, if we haven't worked through our grief, it eventually will come back up. Unprocessed, unhealed grief never stays hidden. It may take a decade, it may take 30 years, I don't know, but it will come up in ways that are unexpected. But what we do when we don't heal from our grief, we start to control. And I'm not sure if I can think about too many times where I've tried to control things and it actually panned out super well. Because the more we try to control, the more we realize we have no control. And if we get caught into that, it becomes this frankly, we start worshiping ourselves. We start pursuing comfort. We pursue control. We pursue all of the things that our culture will give us success and wholeness. But when we can trust God with our future, we have the ability to truly heal in this journey. Now, I would encourage you in this. I want to specifically, trusting God with our future is important, but there's also something about trusting someone else with your grief and your loss. James talks about this. There's something within humanity that I don't fully understand, that when we bring something from the private into the public, even if it's just with a person or a few people that you can trust with your story, God actually provides healing in the midst of the sharing. I don't know why it's that way. I kind of wish it wasn't. But in the midst of that sharing, God heals. That's why authenticity is one of the core values of our church, is that your story matters. Your grief matters. The loss that you have went through and what God has brought you to now matter. You have been comforted so that you can provide comfort to others. Your authentic story in that full color view that we see in Job is a core component of who we desire to be as disciples here in Hernando County. To trust God with your future, find somebody to trust. And a little bit of a word, and this could probably be a whole sermon, so I apologize. This is going to be a little bit of a hot take here. But for us, as we trust others, there's a few things that we need to do as followers of Christ that can be trustworthy in these moments of grief. The first one is be present and don't fix it. All the fixers in the room just said, oh, man. Let's follow the example of Job's friends. For the first 7 days, they just sit with Job, and then they all screw it up when they open their mouths. Those of us that went through it, it's like crazy. It's like the majority of the book is these friends giving good, actually pretty good advice, but totally out of context because they're trying to fix the stuff, the loss, the brokenness of Job. And hear me, more times than I want to admit as your pastor, as a friend, as a husband, and as a father, I have said so many of the things that Job's friends say. This is your loss and your grief. Well, you did something to cause it, so why'd you do that? FYI, not helpful. Job's friends had it right. We need to be patient enough with the uncomfortableness of negative feelings. Once again, I hate them, but we are called to sit in them and be present and don't try to fix it. And the last one, which isn't on your handout, once again, because stuff develops, but I think it is so important, is that you don't need to defend God. You don't actually have to explain the why questions, because every time the friends tried to do it, they were wrong. We don't have to defend God. We can simply follow the instruction of Paul to the Romans when he instructed them to rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. It is literally a mandate of following Christ that we are with those in the best moments and the worst moments. And hear me, as a church, as Fellowship Community Church, we are imperfect and we don't do this well all the time. Please, as we talked about last week, keep showing up. Keep giving people chances. Please keep trusting God and the community. But we, as followers of Christ, need to be able to be present. Don't try to fix it, and don't try to defend God. Because Jesus himself, in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, which is like literally the pinnacle of Jesus' teaching, where like you could just spend a lifetime just reading the Sermon on the Mount, and you're still going to be blown away by the truth. He says in that passage, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." The journey of mourning, of grief, of dealing with our loss is a healthy way of living out our faith. And as the worship team comes forward, I just encourage you. One of Job's really truth as you see the whole narrative, and those of us that survived the whole book get to see this truth that Job teaches us, is that your grief is not the end of the story. It may be a part of it, maybe a season, but it is not the end of the story, and that God redeems as you draw closer to him. And that in Christ we find the ultimate healing. The ultimate healing over any sorrow, any pain, any suffering in this life. Jesus is the hope in grief. Jesus can be trusted to transform us, can be trusted with this future. But for us, what do we do if this hasn't hit yet? Have you ever had a season where you just have a pause and you're just not experiencing any loss? Celebrate, rejoice. But if you're in a season of loss, a season of healing, be willing to look to your past to see how God worked. Be willing to be honest with your current, but ultimately trust God with your future. Because Jesus redeems all things. And we always need to be reminded of that truth as we go into worship together.